Chapter 5. His fellow students at the Divinity College regarded him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Sundar regarded them in much the same way. In their eyes, he was an oddity. He continued to wear his Sadhu's robe, since it had not occurred to him that theological training would in any way interfere with his vocation to live the life of a Christian sadhu. He was by nature quiet and reserved, but to the students his manner appeared standoffish. His spiritual disciplines, although unostentatious, reflected unfavorably on the Christian commitment of many of the students, for whom long hours of prayer and meditation were not deemed a necessary accompaniment to their vocation. What was equally questionable in the eyes of the students was that Sundar came with a reputation. He was already an established figure in Christian circles. Whereas most students presented themselves to the bishop seeking ordination, it was the bishop who had suggested the idea to Sundar. Thus, Sundar found himself in an atmosphere of misgiving and distrust. He was used to hostility in Tibet. He was used to hostility in Indian villages, but here, in a Christian college, surely he would be accepted. He remembered the Christian boys' college at Ludhiana, where the casual attitudes of the pupils had shocked him. They too had seemed to take their discipleship lightly. Once more he pondered the Brahmin priest's brass bowl and the parable it had suggested to him. All his convictions that the water of life, the redemptive love of Jesus Christ, must be presented to the people of India in an Indian vessel were reinforced. Was the training that the church offered the young men at the college appropriate for a ministry in India? The question, together with his uneasy position vis-à-vis the other students, made this period of Sundar Singh's life a frustrated and unhappy one. Bishop Lefroy, in suggesting theological training for Sundar, had perhaps had similar doubts about the European orientation of the Indian church, and hoped that Sundar might embody for the church a pattern of Indian priesthood. Sundar respected the bishop's confidence in him and resisted the temptation to leave the college. For the most part, he found the lectures irrelevant to Christ's teaching. A distrust of abstract theological argument was to remain with him for the rest of his life. Charles Andrews visited Sundar Singh at the college whenever he could get to Lahore, and has recorded this impression. He seemed to me like some bird of the forest, beating its wings in vain against the bars of a cage. For the joyous open freedom at Qatar, with a clear sky overhead and solitude of the hills round about, had been left behind. It was almost as if his wings had been clipped, and I felt deeply distressed about him when I saw what was happening, as though a tragedy was being acted out before my eyes. It was to Charles Andrews that Sundar recounted an incident which marked an improvement in his relations with the other students. He had been puzzled and saddened by their antagonistic attitude. Accordingly, Sundar had prayed that he might make amends for his part in the discord which existed. In particular, he prayed for one boy who had been his most vociferous critic. The same boy heard Sundar at his prayers and was amazed to hear his own name on Sundar's lips. He felt a genuine sense of shame, and there and then approached Sundar. "Forgive me," he said. "My attitude to you has been thoroughly uncharitable." Almost from this moment, a close friendship between the two took root. Gradually, Sundar felt himself more at home in the college. Charles Andrews met the student in question years later who verified the story and declared how this occurrence and his subsequent friendship with Sundar Singh had colored his whole ministry. Thus, his 3 terms at St. John's were not entirely wasted. Even his studies introduced him to writers like Thomas à Kempis, whose Imitation of Christ he read and reread throughout his life. At the end of the year, Sundar left the college with a license to preach, and it was assumed that he would eventually go on to receive deacon's orders. Samuel Stokes had returned from America and was in the process of founding a Franciscan brotherhood. Sundar was interested and encouraging. Although he did not join the community, he attended the service in Lahore Cathedral at which Stokes and another member made their vows. Sundar was not able to commit himself to any such organization. He had other plans. The hot weather had begun as the Divinity College term ended, and Sundar was anxious to get to Tibet, to the work he felt called to do. This proposal caused consternation in some quarters. Had he not just received a license to preach in the Anglican churches in the Diocese of Lahore? For that reason, he could not just set off in whatever direction he chose. Furthermore, as a priest or deacon, he would be committed to working within the Anglican communion and within one diocese of that communion. It is strange that a whole year at the college had passed without this issue being raised. Neither Bishop Lefroy, nor the staff at St. John's, nor Sundar himself had hitherto faced this question. Sundar seemed to have believed that neither a preacher's license nor ordination would in any way limit his work as an itinerant evangelist. He now had to face the fact that other people had quite different ambitions for him. At this particular crossroad, he knew what he must do. His only regret as he returned his preacher's license to the bishop was a reluctance to disappoint Dr. Lefroy, who had been a good friend to him. The bishop, however, accepted Sundar's reasons, acknowledging generously that he had been mistaken in his plans for the young man. For Sundar, the renunciation of his license had not been difficult. Yet it does symbolize that his was a ministry that knew no sectarian bounds. His calling was to preach to the non-Christian. He gladly left to others within the church the important work of building up the established Christian community. Like John Wesley, he regarded the world as his parish. He remained an Anglican by virtue of his baptism and confirmation. He had been confirmed by Bishop Lefroy in 1907 at Qatar. Throughout his life, he remained a communicant and was a regular preacher in Anglican churches, but he would not be bound by a denominational allegiance, and when he felt it appropriate to step outside its conventions, he showed no compunction in doing so. The world of matins and evensong, chapter meetings, and diocesan committees was wholly foreign to Sundar. His world was the rugged terrain of Tibet, and the giving of his whole being to the preaching of his master's word. It was a world where life itself was constantly at risk. Equally, it was a world where God would send his angels to rescue his servants from danger. Sundar did not find his many miraculous escapes matters to be wondered at. They simply indicated that God still had work for him to do, so he gave thanks for his safety and forged ahead once more. This carefree approach was leagues away from cautious institutional Christianity, although it was not so far removed from traditional Indian spirituality. The modern student of Sundar Singh's life must interpret his many escapes from death and danger according to his own convictions. In particular incidents, the succor which Sundar regarded as the direct intervention of God on his behalf will seem to others to be the workings of nature or coincidence. Taken as a whole, however, few would deny that his life seemed to be remarkably protected. Were the mysterious figures who appeared in times of difficulty or danger men or angels? It was God's care that they exemplified. The ways and means are of minor significance. One such escape occurred in Nepal, the mountainous region that lies between Tibet and India. The angry inhabitants of the village of Kantzi had seized and assaulted Sundar. Wrapped in a blanket, he was bound tightly to a fruit tree outside the village. His persecutors waited for him to die. They were sure he would. If the leeches and scorpions and snakes failed, a leopard would no doubt succeed. Sundar fainted with pain. On recovering consciousness, he awoke to find that he was no longer tied to the tree. His wounds had been tended, and in his hands were fruits from the tree. Sundar thanked God that he had been delivered from death and was encouraged to continue on his journey. In his wanderings through India and Tibet, Sundar continually faced the prospect of sudden death. For his master, he was happy to do so. He was equally happy to be spared for further work. This sort of life, he believed, was God's intention for him, not parochial work in an Anglican mission station. So, on leaving St. John's College in 1910, he returned to the life of a wandering preacher, taking whatever opportunities God put in his way to preach to those who had not heard the Christian gospel. It was during these years that the Reverend Thomas Ewart Riddle first met him. A New Zealand Presbyterian minister, he came as a missionary to the Punjab early in 1912, and was to remain, apart from a period of war service, until 1947. Thomas Riddle was to become Sundar's lifelong friend. He was his executor, and it was he who organized a search party that tried to trace Sundar when he disappeared in 1929. In 1946, Thomas Riddle wrote a series of articles on Sundar Singh in successive issues of the United Church Review, a paper of which he was the editor. These articles were later put together in a book called The Vision and the Call, which was published in India. In the issue for June 1946, he recounts an incident which, in Sundar's eyes, was a case of direct intervention by God on his behalf, but which, in the view of his companion, had quite a different explanation. In a lonely jungle area, Sundar and his friend Samuel Stokes had reached a fast-flowing river. There seemed no way to cross except by swimming. Sundar waded into the water, started to swim, and was striking out powerfully for the other side, when the sheer force of the current swept him down the river towards treacherous rapids. Stokes watched with horror from the bank, powerless to help. Suddenly he looked across to the far side to see a party of hillmen running alongside the river. After slithering down the bank between them, they pulled Sundar out. That was how Stokes recalled the episode. Yet when Sundar told of his escape, he said, "I saw in that instant that God had sent his angels to snatch me from sure death." Whether Stokes or whether Sundar was right, we shall never know. Does one version exclude the other? Probably not. Others, in moments of extreme danger, have sensed the divine presence. There is the well-known story of Sir Ernest Shackleton's experience in his perilous journey across South Georgia in search of civilization and help for his companions left marooned on a small bleak island. He wrote, "I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. I said nothing to my companions on the point, but afterwards Worsley said to me, "Boss, I had a curious feeling in the march that there was another person with us." Crean confessed to the same idea. Those who knew Sundar Singh never doubted his integrity when he related his experiences. However, as Thomas Riddle points out in his article, some of Sundar's listeners felt that such instances of divine intervention occurred during bouts of fatigue and weariness when the borders between fact and fancy are blurred. There were, however, others who, as Sundar's fame spread, were convinced that he was an impostor and used these, as they saw them, extravagant tales of miraculous delivery as proof of their argument. Neither was Sundar helped by the over-enthusiastic support of his more fervent admirers. Anxious to extol their hero, they freely circulated details of his life that he would have preferred to conceal from public curiosity. The summer of 1912 found Sundar once more in Tibet. He chose a route through the border town of Tehri and made for Lake Manasarawar, a region of solitary and mysterious beauty. High above the lake, the haunt of wild swans, tower rocky precipices crowned with ancient Buddhist temples, remote and deserted. Towards this region, Sundar journeyed across the Kailash mountain range. For generations of Hindus, Kailash had held sacred associations. Although the area had the outward appearance of total desertion, it was not entirely uninhabited. Sundar had heard rumors of holy Hindu hermits who had chosen for themselves lives of solitary meditation. And he had always hoped that one day he might meet one, though he regarded the prospect as unlikely, particularly in that desolate area. In fact, he wrote in A Collection of Incidents, a book about his travels written in Urdu, "I had not the slightest conception that anyone could live in so bleak a place." The path he was following was treacherous even for Sundar, who was by now a hardened and experienced traveler in such conditions. His foot slipped on a patch of ice, and he fell down heavily several feet to a lower level. Momentarily stunned, he opened his eyes and noticed to his alarm a figure sitting close by at the entrance to a cave. Sundar recoiled in fear at the sight. It was an incredibly old man with matted hair down to his shoulders. The figure addressed him in somewhat strange terms. "Before we begin to converse together, it will be well for us to pray to God." Sundar's fears receded a little, and he watched intently while the old man fetched an ancient book from his cave, sat down, and began to read aloud. Sundar strained to catch his words. To his amazement, he heard the old man read from the New Testament, part of the Sermon on the Mount. Not only had he come across a hermit, but a Christian hermit at that. Sundar was anxious to know how he'd become a believer. Here is Sundar's account of the old man's reply, as he recorded it in A Collection of Incidents, written early in 1915. He said, "My birth was in Alexandria. When I was 30 years of age, Jarnos, the nephew of St. Francis Xavier, baptized me. Up to my 75th year, I preached in the whole world. I spoke 21 languages well. When I knew that I could no longer travel about, I gradually made my way to this place. I have been living here for 209 years. God has committed to me the ministry of prayer, that I should pray for different places in turn." He went on to tell Sundar that he believed that Christ's coming was imminent, that Christ would reign for 1,000 years visibly on earth, after which there would be the resurrection and judgment of sinners. Sundar was deeply moved with the hermit's words. If he entertained any doubts concerning the Maharishi's, Indian word meaning a great seer, claimed that he could move in spirit throughout the world as he prayed, these doubts were removed when the Maharishi told him many things about his own life and friends that he could not possibly have been expected to know. Sundar continued his account. Afterwards, more conversation followed. It is hoped that when some friends go with me to meet him, a complete and detailed account may be written, along with a picture of the venerable saint. Inhabited dwellings begin at a distance of about 80 miles from where the Maharishi lives. His food consists of various forest roots, which are exceedingly strength-giving. One more amazing thing he mentioned to me, and prophetically said that within a short time, a wonderful occurrence would happen to me, which would greatly strengthen my faith. To illustrate the Maharishi's strange foresight, Sundar goes on in his book to tell how, on his way down from Mount Kailash, he met a group of people who deliberately misdirected him when they realized he was a Christian. He had inquired the route to the nearest village, but they had sent him instead along a hazardous forest path. Night soon enveloped the landscape. There was no sign of a village. Sundar could hear the cries of wild animals in the jungle around him. At length he reached a river, but it flowed too swiftly for him to wade across. The prospect looked bleak, and Sundar was near despair. A light on the far bank attracted his attention. A man was sitting by a fire. He stood up and called across to Sundar. "Do not be troubled. I am coming to get you." To Sundar's surprise, the man did exactly that. After wading through the river, he carried Sundar on his shoulders back to the far side. Safe across the river, Sundar turned to thank his guide. He was no longer there. nor could he find any trace of the fire. Sundar remembered the Maharishi's prophecy. A hermit, 300 years old, a prophecy so explicitly fulfilled. Do such things happen in the 20th century? What are we to make of them? Sundar was to meet the Maharishi on 2 further occasions. The stories of these encounters with the Maharishi of Kailash are perplexing to the modern reader. A host of questions are raised. For instance, there are those relating to the claim by the Maharishi that he was baptized by a nephew of St. Francis Xavier. On his own reckoning, the Maharishi had been born 284 years before he first met Sundar in 1912. The year of his birth, therefore, would have been 1628. Francis Xavier lived from 1506 until 1552 and was the youngest of 5 children. Had the Maharishi at the age of 30 been baptized by a nephew of St. Francis Xavier, this would have taken place in 1658, 106 years after the saint's death. Moreover, it is known that St. Francis had almost nothing to do with his family after he left home in 1525. Do these considerations discredit the historical accuracy of the story? Could Sundar have dreamed the whole thing, while unconscious from his fall? If so, how can his subsequent meeting with the Maharishi be explained? The questions are endless, and they have all been asked. Sundar's critics certainly questioned his integrity in the matter. How did his friends regard the affair? Charles Andrews gives us a hint of the way Sundar's friend Susil Rudra felt about it. Now and then he, Susil Rudra, was perplexed by the strange narratives which the Sadhu brought back concerning his wanderings in Tibet, and he would often argue with him that much of what he had experienced had been due to his highly wrought imagination. He doubted some of the stories, but he never doubted for a moment the sincerity and simplicity of the Sadhu himself. That was beyond question. The views of another personal friend, Ayadurai Yesudasan Appasamy, who was to become Sundar Singh's chief biographer, are very relevant here. A.J. Appasamy, later bishop in Coimbatore and a man with immense knowledge of Indian Christianity, went to considerable lengths in his book Sundar Singh, 1958, to find a satisfactory answer to this controversy. He concluded that there were 3 legitimate ways of regarding Sundar's experiences with the Maharishi. There is the possibility that he fabricated the whole story, but as Bishop Appasamy points out, lifelong friends could testify to his truthfulness. Furthermore, Sundar was very willing to take others to see the Maharishi. 2 such expeditions did in fact set out, but neither of them achieved their destination. Secondly, it could be argued that Sundar saw the Maharishi in a vision. As he grew older, ecstatic experiences became a frequent occurrence in his spiritual life. However, the visions he saw while in a state of ecstasy usually served to illuminate a specific problem that was troubling him at the time. Life after death was something which particularly exercised his mind, and most of his visions illuminated his difficulties on this very subject. Lastly, there is the possibility that Sundar did see a very old hermit praying in a cave near Mount Kailash. Reports from travelers who had sighted such people were quite frequent. An American mining engineer reported that he had seen such an old man, and the Reverend Yunus Singh of London Missionary Society was told in 1916 by Tibetan traders about a very, very old rishi who lived in the Kailash mountains just below the snow line. It seems likely, therefore, as Bishop Appasamy says, that Sundar did meet the Maharishi, who may indeed have been very old enough perhaps to be somewhat confused about his true age. Sundar had no wish to arouse speculation concerning the Maharishi, and when Alfred Zahir's book with its highly colored narratives provoked curiosity, Sundar was troubled. He became reluctant to discuss the Maharishi at all. Bishop Appasamy records that when he first met Sundar Singh in Oxford in 1920, the Sadhu was pressed at a meeting to give more details of the Maharishi. He replied to his questioners, "People have made too much of this incident in my life. The Maharishi is a man of prayer, and I have great respect for him. But my work is not to preach the Rishi, but to preach Christ." Sundar's attitude puts the matter into perspective, and again, we must not forget that this was India, where conceptions of reality are rooted in a culture quite different from that of the pragmatic West. Sundar was part of that culture. He understood it and appreciated it. He was completely Indian and therefore could speak to India. Here perhaps lies the strongest justification for his decision not to be ordained as a deacon in the Church of England. Had he done so, his work would have been mainly amongst those who had embraced not only Christianity but a European mode of life. Sundar's message was to all men, and certainly to his fellow Indians. He was never afraid to preach, even at Hindu shrines. On one occasion he began to talk to pilgrims by the Ganges, who, when they realized he was a Christian, fetched a Hindu sadhu to refute his arguments. On his arrival he approached Sundar, and to the bewilderment of the bystanders, placed his 2 forefingers in Sundar's mouth. "I have done this to prove that we are brothers, and not enemies as you suppose, for we both believe in Jesus Christ as Savior." Sundar was greatly encouraged and spent some hours talking to the sadhu. He discovered that this man believed that it was better to evangelize secretly, in the guise of a Hindu, since he was able to introduce his Christian conviction without arousing hostility. He had already baptized several people. It was not the way Sundar cared to proceed, but he respected his friend's point of view.